There is a sentence people say about themselves so often that it has stopped registering as a claim at all. I'm just not a maths person. I'm bad with words. I don't have the discipline for that. I'd never be able to speak in front of people. Said once, it is a mood. Said every week for 6 years, at every point where the subject comes up, it becomes something else, something closer to infrastructure. And what interests me is that nobody experiences it as a decision. You do not sit down one afternoon and resolve to become a person who cannot do arithmetic under pressure. You simply notice again and again that you are one, and each noticing lays down another layer of the thing you are noticing. I have circled this from several directions over the past year. I have written about the invisible links between one thought and the next, about the way perception is manufactured before it ever reaches awareness, about belief becoming its own confirmation in markets. Each of those essays argued from the inside, from introspection, from watching myself, from watching Price. What I did not have in any of them was a measurement, something physical, a number that moves when the thought moves. There is one, and it has been sitting in the literature since 1995. In Bethesda, Maryland, Alvaro Pascual Leone and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health ran an experiment that I think about more than almost anything else I have read. The paper is called Modulation of Muscle Responses Evoked by Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation During the Acquisition of New Fine Motor Skills, published in the Journal of Neurophysiology, and its title is doing an excellent job of hiding what is inside it. The setup is almost boringly simple. Volunteers, adults, none of them pianists, were taught a one-handed 5-finger exercise on a piano. Nothing virtuosic, the kind of thing a child runs through in a first lesson. They practiced it for 2 hours a day for 5 days, playing along to a metronome and trying to keep the notes even. At the end of each day, they sat under a coil of wire. The coil is the interesting part. Transcranial magnetic stimulation sends a brief magnetic pulse through the skull into the motor cortex, and if you aim it at the right patch of tissue, the corresponding muscle twitches. By moving the coil across the scalp in a grid and recording which positions produce a response, and at what intensity, you can draw a map. This is the territory of cortex that reaches down to those particular finger muscles, and this is how easily it can be woken. Over the 5 days, as the exercise got smoother, the maps for the long finger flexors and extensors grew larger, and the threshold, the amount of stimulation needed to get a response at all, came down. The change was confined to the hand doing the work. The untrained hand's map sat where it had always sat. A control group that came in daily to be mapped and never touched the piano showed nothing. So far, this is unsurprising, in the way that only settled facts are unsurprising. You practice, the machinery devoted to the practice thickens. Then there is the control group I find quietly devastating. A second set of subjects were given a piano and 2 hours a day and told to play whatever they liked with the right hand, with no exercise to learn, no target, no metronome. Their maps changed too, the same direction and significantly less. 2 hours a day of genuine hands-on keys activity, and the machinery moved a fraction of the distance it moved for the group with a specific thing they were trying to do. Effort, on its own, is not the input. Directed repetition is the input. And then there is the second experiment, which is why I'm writing this at all. 15 subjects, 3 groups. One group practiced the 5-finger exercise physically as before. One group did nothing. The third group sat in front of the piano for the same 2 hours a day, for the same 5 days, and imagined playing it. They were instructed to picture the movement, to hear the notes, to run the exercise in their heads while their hands stayed still. Their muscles were monitored to confirm they were not quietly twitching along. At the end of the week, the cortical maps of the mental practice group had enlarged in a manner comparable to the group that had actually played. Not identically. The physical practice group performed better at the keyboard, which is what any of us would expect, and their behavioral gains were larger. But the mental group had improved substantially over the controls without touching a key, and when they were finally allowed a session of real physical practice at the end, their performance came up to meet the level the physical group had reached across the whole week. Sit with that for a moment. Because the popular version of this study, the one that gets repeated in productivity books and sports psychology seminars, flattens it into visualize your success. That is not what happened here, and the difference matters enormously. Nobody in that room imagined applause or a career or being the sort of person who plays piano. They rehearsed a specific sequence of finger movements in exact detail, over and over, for 10 hours. The rehearsal was granular, effortful, and dull. And the tissue responsible for executing that specific sequence reorganized itself around a set of movements that had never once been performed. I want to be careful here because I have written about the temptation to conscript uncertainty into whichever story you were already telling, and I would be a hypocrite to do it now. 15 subjects is a small study. Motor imagery of a defined finger sequence is a clean, bounded thing, and the sentences we repeat about ourselves are diffuse, emotional, and tangled with memory. There is a real gap between a cortical map for the flexor digitorum and whatever physical substrate underlies an goal. I'm not clever enough for that, and I cannot close that gap with a paper about pianos. What the study establishes is narrower and I think sufficient. Rehearsal without action reaches the tissue. Whatever else is true, the boundary we assume between thinking about a thing and doing it is more porous than it feels from inside. Here is the reading I will commit to, and I want it clearly marked as mine rather than as something the paper's authors claimed. There is no dedicated mechanism in the brain whose job is to sort this actually happened from yin-yu. I rehearsed this in my head. No auditor sits between the two, stamping one as real experience and filing the other as fantasy. The machinery takes what it is given and lays down pathway either way, and the only variables that appear to matter much are how specific the repetition is and how often it runs. That is the finding at the center of the study, plainly stated. 10 hours of imagined fingering built roughly what 10 hours of real fingering built, because from the substrate's point of view there was no meaningful difference between them. Follow that where it goes, and it stops being a pleasant fact about visualization. If the machinery is indifferent to provenance, then every hour you spend diminishing yourself is a training session with the same standing as an hour at the keys. Self-doubt, run repeatedly, does considerably more than sit above your abilities and misreport them. It is construction work. Excessive self-critique, the running commentary, the preemptive verdicts, the rehearsed inventory of everything you are supposedly bad at, builds the pathways that make those verdicts progressively easier to reach and progressively harder to root around, until the belief has hardened into the actual boundary of what you can practicably do. The claim was never accurate when you started saying it. You made it accurate. You practiced it into being true. This is the argument I made in The Habitual Nature of Man with an instrument attached, and it corrects that essay in the one place I had it wrong. I had assumed the mechanism required action to run. Rehearsal alone moves the substrate, which means the thoughts you run on loop function as practice sessions rather than as commentary on your life, and it means the ledger is far longer than the one you have been keeping. Count them honestly, and the numbers are alarming. 2 hours a day for 5 days was enough to visibly reshape those maps. How many hours have you given to the sentence about what you are not good at? Not concentrated hours. I mean the accumulated total. The 30 seconds before you raise your hand and decide against it. The walk home rehearsing what you should have said. The 3 minutes in bed replaying the thing you got wrong in a room where everyone else has long since forgotten it. 10 hours is a fortnight of that, at most. Most of us have logged years. And here is where it stops being a curiosity about brains and starts being about your life, because the rehearsal does not stay in your head. It sets your expectations, precisely and in advance, and expectation governs the range of actions you will even consider. This is the machinery underneath what I argued in The Rope and the Leap. You do not decline the opportunity because you assessed it and found it beyond you. You decline it because a version of the attempt has already run, dozens of times, and it ended badly on every occasion, and the ending arrives carrying all the authority of a memory. The verdict feels like evidence. It is a rehearsal performed so often that it acquired the texture of fact, and the refusal it produces then counts as another repetition, filed away as further proof, so that the loop tightens by one turn every time you obey it. I used the language of maps and terrain once before, in the discrepancy between the ideal and the lived reality, to describe how a reading of a situation quietly stops matching the situation. I meant it as a metaphor. Pascual Leon was drawing the map with a coil and a grid. The map is a physical object. It grows toward whatever you rehearse, and you act from it, because it is the only thing you have. Nothing in that arrangement makes the map accurate. It only makes it yours, and it means the map has been under construction the entire time you assumed you were merely reading it. So what do you actually do with this? If you are young and reading this because someone has told you what you cannot do, or worse, because you have been telling yourself and it has started to take, here is the method, as concretely as I can put it. Start by catching the sentence, the exact wording, because specificity is the active ingredient in the whole study. The group that improved most had one defined thing they were repeating. The group playing freely for the same 2 hours moved far less. Vague self-criticism is diffuse and therefore weak in any single instance, and it does its damage through sheer volume. Find the phrase you actually use. Write it down. Seeing it in your own handwriting, outside your head, is often enough to make it look like the claim it always was, rather than the weather it pretends to be. Then walk it backwards, link by link, the way I set out in chains of thoughts. What came immediately before this thought and before that, and where exactly did you cross from a fact into an interpretation? Almost always there is a real event at the bottom, one exam, one teacher, one afternoon at 11 years old, and everything above it is accumulated interest on a very small original loan. Then rehearse the thing you want with the same granularity the study demanded. This is the part the motivational version gets wrong, so be precise about it. Do not imagine having done the thing. Imagine doing it. The specific sequence, the actual motions, the sentences in the order you would say them, the first line of the email, where your hands go. The subjects who improved were running the fingering in order, at tempo. Anything vaguer is the free play condition, and the free play condition barely moved the needle. Pay particular attention to the minutes immediately after you fail at something, because that is the highest leverage rehearsal window you will ever get. Failure comes with attention and emotion attached, and whatever you say to yourself while both are running gets rehearsed with unusual force. I always do this as a practice session. Choosing something narrower and more accurate, I hadn't prepared that part, is also a practice session, and it lays down a completely different map. Then build in the interruption, which is the discernment the habit essay ended on. A pattern serves until reality changes, and something has to be awake enough to break it. Practically, this means that when you catch yourself declining something, you stop and ask one question. Is this refusal coming from evidence or from rehearsal? Have I tried this and found my limit, or have I only ever run the simulation? The two feel identical from the inside. They are entirely different facts about the world, and only one of them is about the world at all. And give it a week before you rule on yourself. 5 days is what it took in Bethesda. It is a genuinely small amount of time to hold a sentence in suspension, and almost nobody grants themselves even that. I should say plainly that none of this promises the outcome. Some things will be beyond you. Ability is real, constraints are real, and a rehearsed self-image can be inflated as easily as it can be crushed. The honest reading of the lemma cuts in both directions, and I would rather you had the version that survives contact with reality. What the evidence supports is narrower and more useful than a promise. The ceiling you are currently working under is, in some meaningful proportion, a structure you have been building through repetition. And much of what you believe about your own limits has never been tested against anything except your rehearsals of it. Which gives the argument in The Weight of Poison a physical mechanism it did not have when I wrote it. Someone else's verdict on you is a report on the limits of their own imagination, and it stays inert for exactly as long as you decline to repeat it. The damage is done in the repeating, for a decade, in the shower, on the walk home, every time the subject comes up. until their throwaway sentence has become the exercise you have practiced more thoroughly than anything else in your life, and the tissue it is written into belongs to you rather than to them. They said it once. You are the one who has been putting in the hours. The volunteers in that study grew the cortex for a piece of music their hands had never played. Whatever you have been running on loop, you are doing the same thing, in the same tissue, by the same mechanism right now, and you have been doing it for years without calling it practice. You may as well choose the exercise.